Hello, welcome to the Project Engineers Toolkit Offshore Accommodation module. Offshore accommodation projects are complex in nature. They involve all the engineering disciplines and have numerous utilities and systems interfaces with the host platform. Offshore accommodation units can vary from small one-man self-contained laboratory cabins to 400 plus bed complexes installed on flotel accommodation semi-submersibles. Where accommodation is concerned, everyone has an opinion, as unlike engineering structural and process equipment projects, people will live, relax and sleep in the accommodation. This puts an additional focus on stakeholder management that's absent from other projects. This module will take you through the accommodation project process, from conceptual design to offshore commissioning, and will provide specific accommodation details that can be used as part of project design checklists. On completion of this module, you'll have the following. You'll be able to understand the different types of accommodation. You'll have awareness of accommodation design requirements. You'll gain the knowledge to effectively manage multidisciplinary accommodation project teams, and it will give you an insight into construction and commissioning aspects of accommodation projects. And what we'll be doing is we'll be covering the items on this mind map in front of you, and you may wish to pause here for a few moments. There are several reasons for a requirement for new offshore accommodation. First is a new greenfield installation. A new installation will require accommodation which may be installed as part of the integrated deck, with all systems commissioned prior to loadout, or as a separate heavy lift installation. There are times, especially when an installation was originally designed to minimise size and weight and cost, that accommodation was sized with little or no spare capacity. Two things drive a requirement for an increase in bedding capacity. The first is operational requirements, such as for a new subsea tieback and reception facilities, or maintenance backlogs. Then we have improvement notices. Improvement notices may be served on installations where the existing accommodation doesn't comply with legislation regarding blast and fire ratings, thus requiring new accommodation. And finally, with temporary requirements. There may be a need to install temporary modular accommodation on board to provide bedding for a short-term capacity requirement. The key stakeholders. At the start of the project, it's important to engage the key stakeholders and keep them fully informed as the project progresses. And this will include the client project manager, the architectural specialist, the main contractor project manager, the hotel services subcontractor, and especially the camp boss who will be responsible for running the accommodation, platform personnel, the accommodation manufacturers, and the independent verification body. The different types of accommodation. We have greenfield, and this is new build living quarters. We have brownfield, this is typically additional living quarters. It's probably more challenging than greenfield due to the interfaces with the existing facility and the associated construction challenges on a live platform. We can have refurbishment, for example, upgrade of existing living quarters facilities, and finally, temporary units. This photograph shows a new build module with a heli deck, and this is planned to be installed using a heavy lift. This next one shows another new build module undergoing transportation to site on a barge. And then types of temporary accommodation. We can have laboratory modules, galley modules, laundry modules, cabin modules, and these can be sleeping and living modules, workspace and workshop modules, medic suite, recreation room module, and finally a locker room module. This slide summarises the types of temporary accommodation unit that may be installed on an installation. In general, these units have their own HVAC and fire and gas systems. These units are normally entered via an airlock and can be shut down automatically, either on internal alarms or by a platform generated shutdown signal. This picture shows a typical temporary accommodation unit, and if you can note the lifting points in each corner to allow for a marine lift, and the self-contained HVAC painted white on the corner. Accommodation projects follow the same design process as other offshore projects. As in other projects, it's important that adequate time and effort is spent on the conceptual design and feed to ensure that the project's fully scoped, as changes in detailed design or manufacture will be orders of magnitude more expensive. We start with conceptual studies, move into feed, detailed design, module fabrication, offshore construction, finally commissioning and handover. For the purposes of this training module, we'll assume a brownfield additional living quarters, an ALQ, as this is probably the most complex to engineer, construct and commission. The initial input information will include POB, personnel on board and bedding requirements. This will come from the client, and this may change as the project definition improves. We'll have the existing platform general arrangement drawings. We'll have the initial allocated space envelope for the accommodation. We'll require the hazardous area drawing showing the relative location and distances to hazardous areas. And finally the structural integrity model, which will require updating with the proposed accommodation loadings. Some considerations for the conceptual study. First, location and topsides. Existing space on an offshore installation is always at a premium, and options for installation include a cantilever platform, destructing the existing accommodation, deck clearance and removal of redundant equipment. We also need to look at integration with platform services, and this includes potable water, drains, fire water, power, fire and gas, etc. Early on we need to decide whether it's going to be a modular or a single heavy lift for brownfield. This is an early decision. Single lift means expense and commitment to a heavy lift vessel, while modular using the platform crane means an extended hookup duration and increased man-hours offshore. Other conceptual study considerations. We need to consider the primary structural capacity. This is fundamental to ensure that the primary structure can withstand the loads that will be imposed from the new accommodation, both during installation and operation. Safety critical elements identification. Technical safety will have a significant involvement on the impact to the safety critical elements associated with the accommodation project. We have escape and evacuation consideration. Studies will be required to be completed evaluating the proposed mustering and escape and evacuation routes under all foreseeable emergency scenarios. And this will include timings for key emergency activities such as evacuation to lifeboats, helideck, etc. The services requirements. The conceptual study will identify the initial requirements for all services and where there's not sufficient platform capacity and where upgrades required. Procurement and installation costs. An important activity in conceptual design is the generation of options for the project and to prepare the overall project costs for each, including installation. From this screening exercise, the project team can get an idea of the sensitivities regarding bed capacity versus costs. After conceptual design, we move on to feed. On completion of the conceptual study, there will generally be one preferred option to take through into feed. Purpose of feed is to fully scope, plan and cost the project to allow it to be submitted for full project execute phase approval. At this point the team size will increase, as will the rate of project expenditure. The feed's probably the most important phase of the project, and sufficient time and effort must be allowed to ensure that a robust feed document is produced. There will normally be several peer reviews during this phase, supported by relevant experts to ensure that the scope's adequately defined. During feed, module fabricators will be pre-qualified to allow an invitation to tender to be issued early in detailed design. In summary, feed produces the definitive scope, cost and schedule to allow submission to the client and to get formal approval to move forward into the detailed design execute phase. Some more feed considerations. Human factors, also known as ergonomics, is the study of how humans behave physically and psychologically in relation to environments. In our case, this is the new accommodation module. By considering and getting human factors right early in the design, risk to both personnel and the wider facility are reduced. This will be covered in some more detail later. Platform services. This will expand on the requirements identified in the conceptual studies and will fully scope what is required for each of the accommodation, piping, electrical and instrumentation systems. Constructability. Enlisting the services of an experienced construction engineer early in feed will ensure that the design produced can be safely and efficiently constructed. Suggestions on how to simplify and optimise the design from the construction engineer are to be encouraged. Lifting and installation studies. 2 installation options: a single heavy lift via crane barge or modular installation using the platform cranes. If you're opting for a single lift, this will be the time to engage a heavy lift contractor to ensure that all aspects of lifting, including site clearance and protection bumpers and guides, are considered and included in the project scope. For a modular lift using the platform crane, this will involve liaison with the crane subcontractor and possible maintenance and modification of the crane to ensure lifting capacity and wind sea state limits are maximised. Design codes and standards. The basis of design provided by the client will provide the relevant statutory instrument codes and standards by which the accommodation should be designed. While this will vary by jurisdiction, the following key documents can be referenced for information: International Standards and Guidance, the UK HSE Guidance for Provision of Offshore Accommodation, NORSOC Standard C001 for living quarters, SOLAS Safety of Life at Sea Accommodation Convention requirements, and finally DNV 2.7.2 Certification for Offshore Accommodation Containers. Numerous other codes and standards, including client specifications, will also apply for each of the individual disciplines. It's recommended to use the services of an offshore accommodation specialist to ensure compliance with the latest applicable accommodation-specific legislation, standards and guidance. Thank you.